My name is Randy Bowman. I'm the treasurer for the Desert Southwest Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church, and I'm here today to present Financial Best Practices Workshop. I've been with the conference for 19 years, assistant treasurer for the first 6.5 years, and I've been the treasurer for the last 12.5 years. I'm a certified public accountant, or CPA, licensed in the state of Arizona. Although I'm not an expert, I've been around long enough that I can usually find it. So feel free to call me and or email me. The purpose of this is not to make you an expert. I mean, if we spend an hour and a half talking about financial best practices, you're not going to know everything you need to know. The main purpose is to let you know what resources are available. So I'll point you in some directions, and the biggest single resource is we're here for you. There's accompanying PDF of all the materials that I'm going to be going through. It's 61 pages, and we're clearly not going to go through all 61 pages today, but I am going to refer to it and highlight some of that. Probably best to do this if you pull that up. On page 1 of the 61 pages of glory that we're going to go through is my contact information. And if it's something that you just want to talk about, call's probably better, and I've got my office phone and cell phone. If it's something where you want some material sent to you, then email's probably best because I can attach it. With that, we'll get started. So we're going to start with pages 2 through 5, which is a financial best practices checklist. This is a checklist that we being the Conference Council on Finance and Administration, or CFA, equivalent to the Finance Committee at the local church. We developed this as something that a church could use. It's partly based on Book of Discipline requirements. It's partly based on legal requirements. You'll see a lot of overlap between this and a local church audit guide that we'll talk about later. Some of the first ones talk about simple controls like counting the offering, which we all do. Not quite as much cash as we used to have, a lot of checks. More and more of your giving is even online and comes in during the course of the week, but we still are passing the offering plates on Sunday, and we're still collecting that, and it still needs to be counted. The offering needs to be counted by 2 people who are unrelated to each other, unrelated to staff, including the pastor, the treasurer, the financial secretary. We can have spouses that count, just don't count with each other. One can count one Sunday. Most churches, if they have enough, try to get people so you're only counting perhaps once a month. Once it's counted, then we have control over the amount of money, and we don't have to worry about if there's money that disappears, because we'll know that something is missing. It needs also to be deposited promptly. I think most churches are counting on perhaps Sunday afternoons. Perhaps the offerings are put in a safe overnight and counted on Monday morning. But as soon as it's counted, we need to get it to the bank. Safety-wise, a couple of people going to the bank is a good idea. Some churches use a courier service to do that. Some churches are even, in today's modern world, scanning the checks and transmitting it to the bank without ever taking it to the bank. Of course, you'll still have to get the physical cash to the bank, but that's a lot less to worry about. So you may want to consider pursuing that with your financial institution. Once we have the totals, we need to give that to the treasurer and the financial secretary, and then they can start moving that. The contributions then are usually posted by the financial secretary or someone under their direction to each of the individual donor accounts using whatever software you're using. And then the statements are sent out periodically. They have to be sent out at the end of the year for tax purposes, but many churches employ a good practice of perhaps sending them out quarterly so that you can see if your donations are current, correctly posted. I mean, people can make mistakes, so it could get posted to the wrong account. So that's a good control that when you get down to year end. The key for most of the internal controls is segregation of duties. And larger churches, that's usually not a problem. Some small churches, we may be lucky if we can get 6 living and breathing people, and it's tougher and tougher to get the segregation duties. So you can do the best you can and do the most important ones. And one of the most important ones is that we have 2 main functions, the financial secretary and the treasurer. If we can keep those separate, then you've got a long way. Basically, the treasurer is responsible for the money going out, the writing of the checks, and then also the reporting to the finance committee and the congregation. The financial secretary is responsible for the money coming in, supervising the offerings, posting them to the donor contribution statements, making sure that that information is given to the treasurer for the reporting purposes. And you can see how that's probably one of the most important segregation of duties, because if those 2 people were perhaps members of the same family, then clearly you could get some collusion. Or if they were done by one person, that's where we run into a lot of issues of fraud, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But despite the fact that we think all the church people in the world are nice and honest, we're still human beings, and fraud, embezzlement in churches is more prevalent than, unfortunately, we would like to think. Some of the other requirements we talk about in this checklist are some of the legal requirements of filing payroll taxes, sending out W-2s to employees at the end of the year, sending out 1099s to independent contractors. Each church is more than a business, but there is a business aspect that we have to adhere to. You don't want IRS coming after you as an entity any more than you want them personally. One comment I will make about the quarterly payroll taxes, which you file on Form 941, is that if you're a small church and you only have 1 employee, and that employee is the pastor, and the pastor does not ask you to voluntarily withhold income taxes from their pay, then you don't have to file quarterly tax returns, because there's nothing withheld from their pay. We'll talk about this later, but clergy are different than you and I may be as lay employees. We have all heard the concept of FICA taxes, which is really Social Security and Medicare added together. And when we get paid, we have the sum of those two, 7.65%, withheld from our pay, and then our employer pays the other 7.65%, matching that, and that's how the taxes are paid. So we have to, the money that's withheld from our pay, our employer has to send that in to IRS, and they do that through the 941s. Well, if you're a clergy person, you are an employee for income tax purposes, so you do have to be paid a W-2, but there's several differences, and we'll talk a little bit about housing versus cash salary later. But one of the differences is that for Social Security and Medicare purposes, you are self-employed. So you have to take care of those taxes through quarterly estimated tax payments generally. Some clergy will ask the church to voluntarily withhold federal and perhaps state income taxes from their pay. But if they don't do that, there's nothing that a church is required to withhold. So there would be no money if that was your only employee to have to send into IRS. So that's why you wouldn't have to file a Form 941 if you have one employee that's a clergy person and they don't have any taxes withheld from their pay. Obviously, if that's your only employee and they do ask you to withhold it, then you are going to have to remit that in on a quarterly basis to IRS. The reality is that once you file your first 941, you're on IRS's radar screen, and if you get a change in clergy through a new appointment and they don't want it withheld, you're going to have IRS after you on why you didn't file it, even if you don't have to. So you're better off at that point sending it in with zeros in there. Just a little aside. So you do need to issue W-2s to the clergy at the end of the year, even if you haven't withheld, because the cash salary portion of their compensation is reportable for income tax purposes. If you have any paid staff that you treat as employees, then you would issue W-2s. You also may be using some independent contractors. You may have a janitor that cleans the building, that cleans buildings for other people. You may have some part-time musicians. You may have an outside accountant that you utilize. And if you're paying them not as employees but as an independent contractor, then you have to issue them a Form 1099 at the end of the year. And that just is a way of reporting to IRS that you have paid that independent contractor X amount of dollars to ensure that they report that income on their income tax returns. And that's a requirement if you pay any independent contractor $600 or more per year. So keep in mind that in addition to a lot of these controls, you have these legal reporting requirements that the Finance Committee has a responsibility for making sure gets done. Staff may be doing it, but you need to make sure that they're filed because, again, you don't want IRS after you. The other requirement that we'll talk a lot about, but that's on this checklist that's pretty important, is having an annual audit. That doesn't mean you have to pay for an outside CPA, but you do need to do that audit. It's a good way to check, and it's for the protection of the staff that are handling it, that things have been reviewed and they looked generally okay. Both the states of Nevada and Arizona, which all but one or two of our churches reside in, require an annual corporation commission report to be filed, and listing officers and directors. And those, by Book of Discipline, the responsibility for corporate governance resides with your Board of Trustees. So they're generally listed as the officers. Maybe a little bit different if you have a single board governance structure. If you do that, then you might have not an entire Board of Trustees listed as your officers and directors, but you might have some of those members. Other recommended best practices that show up on pages 3 to 5 of the materials, I'm not going to go through all of them, but they include things like endorsing the backs of the checks as soon as they come in. They might come in through the mail during the week. They might be on Sunday, but that prevents them from being misappropriated. If you just get an endorsement stamp that says, pay to the order of Bank of America, First United Methodist Church of any town, and your account number. So restrictively endorsing the checks as soon as you get in. Doing bank reconciliations is extremely critical. We do have more instances of financial fraud than we would like to think. But if you're reconciling the bank statements at least monthly, it's going to be detected. So it's not going to go on for months and months and months, because even if somebody's doing something with the funds and writing a check, they have to charge that somewhere. So it's going to go to somebody's budget, and they have to explain why they're over budget, or it's going to go on some balance sheet. And if you're reviewing monthly reports, you're going to pick it up on a pretty timely basis. We actually do bank reconciliations on a daily basis here at the conference, partly to keep that control, but another reason we do it is more and more of our funds are coming in electronically deposited and not in check. And how do we know that it's coming into the bank account without looking in it each day? It's no different than probably your personal bank account. It's probably not good to just wait and look at that at month end when your bank statement comes in. Another reason is, what if some fraudulent check hit your account, which we've had at our conference? Somehow checks get lost in the mail, or somebody gets a hold of and they reproduce it, and every now and then get it through a deposit in the bank. Well, it's going to hit our bank account. If we can detect that the day after it happens, it's a lot easier to get that reversed than waiting 30 days. So just like you're hopefully monitoring your own personal bank accounts pretty often, it's probably good to check online for your accounts here. And if you can reconcile it daily or weekly rather than wait till the end of the month, you're much better off. But certainly don't let it go beyond a month. If you've never reconciled your bank statement, you're never going to detect. And that's how fraud can go on for a long time and build up to something that might be a few $100 issue can turn into thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. There are other requirements in there. Approving invoices. Generally, you want whatever department it's Sunday school curriculum. You want somebody who's overseeing the Sunday school to approve those invoices. If it's related to some compensation, you might want SPRC approving it. So just the appropriate person approving it before it's paid. It's good to have at least 2 check signers on your account. You may not always require 2 signatures on each check. We do that at the conference only above a certain dollar amount. Checks below that can be signed by 1 person. The other advantage is it provides continuity. We know that we rely a lot on volunteers at churches, and if we have some turnover and suddenly you need to get information about the bank account and that person's not there anymore, you're not going to be able to go down to the bank and say, give me that information unless you have an authorized check signer. You can, but it's a lot of hoops to jump through. Should a pastor be a check signer? And generally the answer is no, other than for Good Samaritan or benevolence funds. It protects the pastor. It should be finance committee members or her chairs, perhaps a paid staff, but whoever the finance committee deems appropriate, but not the pastor generally signing on checks for their protection. You're going to have probably more turnover with clergy than you are with the volunteer staff at a church. Some churches offer credit cards. If we have that, then the finance committee needs to establish the controls. It needs to be in the church's name and not in the individual's name. Using the church ID, you need to have the policies in place for receipts being turned in, and who has, if there are dollar limits and what it can be used for. Most churches are going to have some online bank account access, so you need to establish the controls over where the pins are, not hopefully taped to the side of your computer, but it should be retained somewhere at the church, all the documentation at the church, not at a volunteer treasurer's house. So hopefully a lot of these controls help in preventing fraud, but they may not. If you do detect it, then you do need to report it to the police. We can't just say, oh, we're going to be Christian and just let it go, or we'll terminate the person and let them go quietly, or ask, even if it's a volunteer, ask them to not volunteer. The other thing to keep in mind for that is if you ever want any recovery from insurance for dishonesty, financial dishonesty, our current insurance carrier, which is Church Mutual, is going to require that you file a police report in order to get any recovery. And that recovery, by the way, is limited. It only goes up to $100,000 per instance, which is another reason for trying to detect this pretty timely, because stuff that's gone on for many months or years can exceed $100,000. So that is the first section on the financial best practices checklist. Again, if you want to get that in any electronic form, just let me know and I can send it to you. We'll see a lot of these things pop up in some of the other sections later on.